What a great crowd tonight. This is an exciting program. I'm really anxious to get started tonight. My name is Chris Costa. I'm the executive director here at the International Spy Museum, and I'm excited to introduce the program Unveiling the Secrets of the Bridge of Spies with our four amazing panelists and our own Dr. Vince Houghton, who will be moderating. First, we have Gary Powers, Jr. Gary. Gary has a big fan club. Gary is the founder and chairman emeritus of the Cold War Museum, founded in 1996. Because of his efforts to honor Cold War veterans, the Junior Chamber of Commerce selected him as one of the 10 outstanding young Americans for 2002. Gary is the author of Letters from a Soviet Prison and Spy Pilot, which both helped to dispel the misinformation surrounding the U-2 incident. He is a board member of the Strategic Air Command and Aerospace Museum and an honorary member of our museum here. Recently, he consulted for the Steven Spielberg Cold War thriller Bridge of Spies. We're also excited to have Vin Arthey. He has worked as a television producer. Where are you, Vin? There you go. As a university academic, his research and published work on the spy we know as Rudolf Abel has been praised by many across the spy world, from John Le Carre to Boris Lobosov. I don't know if I got that right. Press bureau chief of the Russian External Intelligence Agency, known better as the SVR. Residing in Edinburgh, Scotland, Vin is a biographer and reviews Cold War and espionage books for the national daily, The Scotsman. Recently, Vin joined us on a podcast here at the museum to discuss the life of Rudolf Abel. Our next panelist, Mary Ellen Fuller, is the daughter of... There you go. That's all right. Also brought her own crowd with her. She is the daughter of James B. Donovan, the subject of the Oscar-winning Steven Spielberg film Bridge of Spies. Mary Ellen's first 20 years were unique experiences that gave her a front row seat to history and behind-the-scenes access to dramatic events. Mary Ellen's home textile design career spanned 35 years, beginning as a director of design for a number of prestigious companies. Shortly after winning the industry's prestigious Home Tex Award in Springs, Colorado, she was invited to move her home office in Fort Mill, South Carolina. She has recently joined the board of the South Carolina Humanities, is very engaged and active in her local community. Presently, she is finishing her debut novel and developing a new screenplay. We certainly want to track that novel so we can get you to unveil it here and we can do some podcasts. All right. That's scary. Last but not least, we're joined by Beth Amorosi. Currently, she is... give her a hand, too. What a great audience tonight. Everyone's very upbeat. Currently, she is president of her own firm, AMO Communications, as well as consultant to leading marketing firms, including Fastlane Communications, where she is a managing director. Additionally, she founded the Donovan Global Exchange, a nonprofit organization inspired by the legacy of her grandfather, James B. Donovan, dedicated to transcending boundaries for the exchange of dynamic ideas and implementation of action to create new avenues of opportunity for learning, growth, and change for youth in marginalized areas of society. We are excited to have these four individuals here tonight to discuss one of history's most notable spy trades involving Rudolf Abel, Francis Gary Powers, and James B. Donovan. So now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Vince to get the discussion started. Thank you again, everyone.
And I'm Vince, by the way. Just There it is. There it is.
Everyone.
So we're really happy to have everyone here tonight. I mean, this is really going to be a panel about family. This is, you're at the Spy Museum, you want to come hear about spies. There'll be a lot of that tonight too, but this is really kind of trying to bring down these historical figures that maybe a lot of us have read about in our history books or learned about through school or other places, and realize that they're not just names on a page. They're not just these kind of weird historical figures that none of us can really identify with. These are fathers, these are sons, these are brothers, these are grandfathers. They had all the same hopes, fears, and dreams that all of us do. and trying to find a way to humanize these people that are just, they're abstractions to many of us. They're pages in a history book, and we want to try to bring that to life here today. And so we're really proud to have this panel. This is kind of the dream team of being able to have this conversation about this moment in history that really helped to redefine the way the Cold War was thought of. I mean, this is a time when the kind of thawing a little bit began. You had some bumps in the road as you went forward, but this is a chance to kind of come together in one particular area in Germany, and East met West in a very poignant manner.
And Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn, yes.
Oh,
Yeah, Brooklyn, all right. So one of the interesting things that I want to start with is both Mary Ellen and Gary, because I've read a lot about what you've written about your fathers. And one of the most extraordinary things to me is that for both of you, for much of your life, in fact, for the entire time that your father was alive, your parents, James Donovan and Gary Powers Sr., were just dad. They were just, you didn't know them as this huge historic figure. You didn't know them as a guy who changed history or guys who changed history. They were just your father. So Mary, can you talk a little bit about that, growing up, really just looking at this man who Tom Hanks later played in a movie by Steven Spielberg, who was just dad to you?
Well, do I bring up how much I got each week as a school kid? Does that come up? He was indeed my father. And I will say that it always came back to me when we were picketed. We were constantly being picketed. Dad would get picketed because he was defending a commie. Or then he was getting picketed because he was president of the Board of Education of New York City during integration and busing. He had his first heart attack then. Then we were picketed when student uprisings in 1969 were national, and he was getting locked on elevators as president of Pratt Institute. And so the picketing, I just thought it was normal. It never occurred to me that this was it was just part of my life. Oh, they're at it again. Okay. And I'd wave, and they're all yelling at me, and I thought, oh, my Lord. But he always wove us children into history. So he'd say, well, now, Mary Ellen, Shirley Chisholm's coming tonight. She's coming for dinner, and you can greet her at the door, and you can offer her a sherry. Well, I was 10, and I thought, okay, I can do that. I'll pour, People were always coming into our lives. Jimmy Breslin, he was hilarious. He did a wonderful story on my father based on his coming over several nights in True magazine, 1962. He wrote, I think, one of the best articles on my dad.
I think one of the extraordinary stories is something that your brother experienced was your father, if people don't know this, actually negotiated the release of the Bay of Pigs captives, those that were captured by the Castro regime, and he went down and spoke with Castro. He didn't just go by himself. How old was your brother when you brought him to talk to Castro?
Oh, well, yeah, we all had something to play. My father was negotiating as an individual lawyer going into Cuba, since Cuba wasn't recognizing the United States. So he would do this, but the missile crisis was a problem. So periodically during this period, he couldn't go in. So his first visit back to Cuba, he had to do something personal to bring it back to the boys that were on the Isle of Pines. And he thought the only way to do it is I'll bring my son. And when he was with Castro was thrilled. And he simply said, we're talking about boys here. These are boys in prison. So I'm representing the parents. I want my son to, spend time with you. So
he made it about family.
He made it about family, and he took me to Russia. That was fascinating, 10 or 12 days trying to hunt down Colonel Abel. So, and it was fun. I had mentioned to you that we'd sit and play lots of gin rummy. He was always waiting for the phone call. And he'd say, now, Mary Ellen, be careful what you say, because we're being bugged, I said. And I thought this was perfectly normal in my life. Okay, Dad, we're getting bugged.
So Gary, well, yeah.
Perfectly normal is basically what it was. my experience growing up is Dad was a pilot. He was working for Lockheed when I was born. He did that up until 1970 when I was 5 years old. So my father was a pilot. I was aware of that. I would go to the airport. I would see the planes. I have pictures of me when I'm 5, 7, 10 years old at airports and in planes with my father. He went on to fly for KGIL radio station in a Cessna. He went on to fly helicopters for NBC. So for me, growing up, my dad was always a pilot. And I was aware that my father had been shot down, imprisoned, and exchanged for a Soviet spy. But my perception as a young kid, everybody's dad went through that. That perception changed on August 1st of '77. My father passed away on a helicopter crash while working for NBC television, and that's when the light bulb went on. That's when I realized not everybody's dad gets shot down, imprisoned, or exchanged. But by that time, I'm starting to realize that, wow, Dad's in the history books. Oh, he's going to be buried at Arlington Cemetery. Oh, people want to ask me questions about it. I didn't know what to answer. I wasn't sure what the answers were. And so throughout high school, as a result of my dad's death, I was very introverted. In college, I came out of my shell, and I started to do research, which led to my first book, and now my second one coming out next year. But my research started not to vindicate my father, not to honor Cold War veterans, not to start a museum or anything like that. I wanted to find out the truth, so I knew how to answer questions. And this is what set me on this path, was the untimely death of my father, because he was not around to answer them for me.
So Vin, let me move on to you, because excuse me, Rudolf Abel, a Soviet spy. We in the West, not all that big fans of Soviet spies, especially ones that are infiltrating the United States. So it's very easy for us to kind of hold him up as this villain. And the movie dispels a lot of that. It makes him a very likable character. But even in print, when you read about Rudolf Abel, or Willie Fisher, his real name, it's very easy to kind of fall back into this trend of he's the enemy. But Fisher also is a family man. This is somebody who really, at his heart, didn't want to be a spy. He wanted to do something else, and he wanted to have a family. He wanted to have kids. He wanted to be like everyone else.
Yeah, this is working. It's good. The subject of my book, this man, Abel Fisher, the key resource for this book was his daughter, Evelyn, who died a few years ago. And I learned from her how important family was to her father. But going back specifically to Vince's point, yes, Fisher himself was born in the United Kingdom. His father was a Leninist. He was exiled into the UK. The young Fisher was born in the UK. When the Soviet Union was established, the old man took the family back to the promised land. And the young man Fisher, his father was a native German speaker. His mother was a Russian speaker. His native language was English. He'd been born in the United Kingdom. He'd learned French and Latin at school. He was a logical, as a Bolshevik, entrant into the Foreign Intelligence Service. He started off in the Red Army, but then fell in love, got married. And what do you do when you get married? You got to get a job. And everyone said, well, you'll be an ideal candidate for the security services. So he joined what became the KGB. So that's his background. And Evelyn, his first daughter, told me a lot about their family life.
And you mentioned to us earlier when we were talking beforehand, Evelyn, to the day she died, didn't call him Dad or William or anything. There was a very loving relationship between the two.
Absolutely. Evelyn was his only daughter, his only child. But something I discovered, English was the language of their home. Just imagine working for the NKVD, Stalin, the KGB. The home was a haven, and English was the language of the home. So during the few years I spoke to Evelyn, she was absolutely overjoyed that she could speak English. And she called her father Daddy, Daddy this, Daddy that. It was a very warm, loving relationship.
So it'd be very easy to look at the fathers in this case, and you have a pilot who is the cream of the crop within the Air Force and then later for the CIA. The only reason you get chosen for the U2 program is if you're the best of the best. You have someone who was chosen to be a Soviet illegal, which means they were the best intelligence officer. And then The Bridge of Spies movie has everyman Tom Hanks, the kind of bumbling, stumbling guy who just finds himself in an extraordinary situation. And that, to me, as a historian, I kind of cringed at that a little bit because, Beth, your grandfather was not just another guy. He wasn't just some lawyer in New York who was chosen to do this spy trade because he was the only one that agreed to do it. This is somebody who had, at this point, decades of service, not only for some intelligence agencies in the United States, but also some major things that people have heard of. Can you talk a little bit about what made James Donovan the choice at this moment?
Choice, I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
So what made him perfect for negotiating this trade? What gave him the background that he was the guy that they wanted to go to?
Well, I'd like to share a couple of comments on that. One, he was somewhat of an ordinary man in terms of the fact that he was a family man. He was very warm and amiable and congenial, but he was also, incredibly smart and funny. And I think all of those attributes lent themselves very well to the situations that he was put in. And the movie really played up the ordinary man, I think, and it did. I think for effect, and I think it did it very well. But he was chosen for the jobs that he was chosen for a reason, and the movie left a lot of that out.
I mean, this is a guy who was the general counsel for the OSS.
Yeah.
Somebody who was actually a lawyer for the OSRD, which is at my neck of the woods. I do science and technology. OSRD ran the Manhattan Project and other things. And of course, he worked as a assistant counsel for the Nuremberg trials, and then we talked about the Cuba thing too. I want to talk a little bit about that, Mariana, if you want to.
Well, what's interesting is that the OSS, he was just out of Harvard Law, and while Bill Donovan hired him, and he was inducted into the OSS, he became general counsel. That was critical during World War II because you had to judge every other country and see how their set of laws were. And you had to work together in tandem. Now, how do you do that? So it was his job to study every possible country, how their laws were set up, and make sure that everybody dovetailed and pushed in one direction. When you do something like that, you really get a look at people's agendas. And you start studying people as individuals to see what is it that person is trying to get from me? What is that person doing? It was perfect when he moved into associate prosecutor at Nuremberg for the same exact reason. It was a study of human nature. So the one thing I loved about the Bridge of Spies was that he had an agenda. He had a mandate. He had to get Gary Powers out. He learned about Pryor. He had his own mandate. But if you see in the movie, there are a lot of moving parts and people pecking at him, getting him. Do this, do that. He took it all in. He just was going to quietly keep his own confidence and move forward and get the job done. He was an individual lawyer. He wasn't government. So he didn't really have to abide by any of the mishigash that was going on around him. And he learned that in the OSS and Nuremberg.
A quick question with you. For your dad, he worked for the OSS, but was he in the field or was he always behind a desk?
He started off doing mundane things, which none of us care to think about. Okay, this man's throat was slit in Lisbon, and who gets the $10,000 that was found in his breast pocket? He thought that was fascinating. We have to worry about this. Who has ownership of those monies? Crazy, crazy things that had to be solved along the way. He would tell me about training spies. There is a location that's secret in Maryland that was the training of spies and the OSS.
Go play golf there right now.
Oh, good. All right. And he would tell me how
National Country Club, but yeah.
they trained a woman. She was perfect. She was doing a great job. 6 months of training, and she was letter perfect. And they dropped her into Holland. And Dad said to me, it was just amazing. She went to a street corner, waited for the light to change, and she looked in the wrong direction. And they picked her up. And it was just that elementary. There was another time when a man was cutting his steak in a different way that anybody had noticed. Now, he's not from around here. Why is he cutting his steak like that? Those were fascinating things he would contribute. But all in all, he was a student of human nature to make decisions on negotiation. And it was brutal as a kid, trying to negotiate with your father.
So let me ask you, Gary and Vin. I think there's been some extraordinary. I honestly am an outsider to this, so I'm looking at this, try as objectively as I can. We've already talked a little bit about some of the similarities between Abel, Fisher, and Francis Gary Powers. There's a lot. They're both patriots in their own kind of way, from different sides. Certainly, they're professional intelligence officers. One is doing it from way up in the sky at 70,000 feet, the other on the ground as a human intelligence officer. But they're both incredibly stoic under pressure. They found themselves in situations that most people would break under. Do you kind of see them as kindred spirits? You've spent most of your life studying Abel, you spent most of your life looking at your dad and trying to understand it. Do you think they'd be friends? If they had lived long enough to meet up together in a bar somewhere, do you think they would be friends?
When I was writing the book, I was asked, did I like Fisher? And I said, I don't think he would have liked me very much. And they said, why? And I said, because I talk too much. I think Fisher was a real professional. He kept himself to himself. He was quiet. He wasn't a womanizer. Male friendship was important in his life. I'm not a psychologist, but I think I put that down to the difficult relationship he had with his mother. But he was an utter professional, and he did the job that he was required to do from the moment he joined the service till the moment he died.
And this is similar with my father. My father was a professional. He did his job. He did it to the best of his ability. One of the comparisons that I want to bring out is regards to when Abel and my father was exchanged. Each goes home to the respective countries. Abel returns home very well received by the Soviet Union. Still a little bit of a shadow over him because did he turn? Was he a plant? I mean, there's still a little concern from the KGB as to did he follow orders and do everything. My father comes home. There's all this press negative about how my father had defected. He'd landed the plane intact. He spilled his guts and told the Soviets everything he knew. So these two dichotomies here. But in fact, my father, just like Rudolf Abel, did not spill his guts, did not give any information out to the enemy that they were being interrogated by. But it's just interesting to see how the different perceptions manifested itself upon their returns home to their respective countries.
So Beth, you were very young when your grandfather died. Died in 1970, I believe, or was it 71? Abel was 71, right?
Died, yeah.
Died. Okay, so they're right next to each other. How much growing up did you learn about the legacy of James Donovan? Because now it's everywhere, right? Now Tom Hanks has played him in a Steven Spielberg movie. How much of that legacy was passed down to you as a kid from the rest of your family, from Mary Ellen, from your parents, about carrying on that tradition?
Well, definitely I grew up, surrounded by all of the pictures and the books. And, I knew that he was someone when I was very young. He died when I was 3. So I really have very, very faint memory of him as, alive. And then, in high school and college, all of us did papers on, the incident. Not all of us, or 3 out of 4 of us, I think, did. And, I always heard my grandmother talking, because there was supposed to be a movie made back in the 60s, shortly after the first publication of Strangers on a Bridge. And Gregory Peck was going to play my grandfather. And for whatever reason, it was shelved. And it never happened. So I grew up, hearing that all the time, and my grandmother saying, I've written to Robert Redford, and I've written to this person, and finally, but I never really talked about it too much with friends. I think mainly because our generation really didn't know as much as my parents' generation about the incident. And whenever Cuba came up in the news, he was kind of lost to history. So I kind of had to explain who he was. And I just I didn't really talk about it too much. And then there was a biography published about him in 2005, and that was when I really took an more active role and trying to, work with my family on making something happen. And sometimes karma or the universe has a way of working its magic separately and independently, and that's really what happened, and we were very, very lucky and blessed.
Marilyn, you talked to me earlier about the whole Gregory Peck earlier movie thing.
Thanks.
I thought, they picked, Steven Spielberg cast Mark Rylance, who won an Academy Award for playing Rudolf Abel, but there's an interesting choice potentially to play him originally, and some of the conversations about that movie were fascinating to me when you were telling me about them earlier.
Well, it was interesting. Strangers on a Bridge was picked up by MGM, and they chose Gregory Peck to play my father. Dad kind of liked Spencer Tracy, but he was taken. But Gregory Peck was chosen, and Alec Guinness, which I thought was an interesting choice, was to play Colonel Abel. The screenplay, which I didn't mention to you, was also a fascinating man, Peter Ustinov. And he would come to our house and try to get things just right. So my father and I were in London, and it was great. We spent several days with Gregory Peck, and I always loved it when he was trying to campaign for this role. And he said, Jim, I got an Oscar for playing a fictitious lawyer. I just know I can do this. I just know. And he actually sweetened the pot, and Dad comes in and says, Greg wants to know if you'll go out with his son tonight. I said, oh, he's really pulling out the stops on this one. It was fascinating. I loved it.
Did you go out?
Wait, I did. I'm not passing that up. I had a little friend in Park Slope, Brooklyn, and I knew her since I was 7 or 8. And Vin always laughs at me when I tell this story. And there's Dad announcing, Gregory Peck wants to know, will you have dinner at their home tonight? And his son's going to pick you up. And I sat there and I said, oh boy, I can't wait to tell Patty Dennehy. And she's just a little friend on Garfield Place in Park Slope, but Vin always thinks that's the funniest. Bringing it back to family and personal,
Exactly. So let me ask Gary, and actually Vin everyone can chime in on this, because this is, let's take it another step as far as fathers are concerned. Your grandfather had a pretty close relationship, or at least a close conversation with Jim Donovan, because your grandfather, right when your father was shot down and taken prisoner, immediately went to try to get him out. And obviously when Jim Donovan was brought into this, there was that connection between the two. You want to talk a little bit about that, and obviously we can bounce it around.
Sure. Well, when I started to do my research 25 years ago, I never realized that my grandfather and James Donovan interacted. And in going through the letters that my father wrote to and from prison, there's one that was written by my grandfather to Donovan, not to Donovan, but to my father in prison, that talked about Donovan. And I want to read this to you here, if I can find it real quick.
Want me to hold this?
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Okay, got it. Thank you. So my dad's in prison. He's writing letters back and forth to his loved ones. Oliver is behind the scenes trying to do everything he can to get the release of his boy. He writes a letter to Rudolf Abel in prison. Abel writes him back. Basically says, hey, I can't help you. You have to write my wife in East Germany, a.k.a. the KGB. My grandfather writes to Khrushchev, trying to say if he can get leniency. Let me serve out his prison stay. Let my boy come home. Anything he could do to get my dad's release. So he's writing this letter to my father, and he says the following. This is June of '61. Dear son, in answer to your 16th letter, Mom told you she had just got home with her third trip from the hospital. She is much better now. She has had a much better breathing time than the other times. We don't know how long till she has to go back with another spell. We hope not for a long time. I could not find out what was discussed at the Khrushchev-Kennedy meeting June 3rd, but I did have a call from blank, a lawyer in New York. He is in touch with blank in East Germany, and blank is working for a release from that end and blank this end. Just how much good it will do is yet to be seen. I want you to take care of your health and yourself above all things. I was told that I would receive a letter from East Germany. I have not received it yet. I blocked out a few names that I did not want to mention in this letter. I will later on. We'll have all of our hay up first cutting, 3 acres of corn, 3 seeds of rye. This fall, have 8 heads of cattle to bring calves this year, November or December. We'll close for the time. We're all doing our best to help you, and we'll continue to do so. Your Pop. So here I'm reading this letter, thinking the KGB had blacked out these names. Turns out that my grandfather blacked out his own names. And then my dad replies to him and basically says, if I can get my thing open again, I got it. In July of '61, Dad writes back, "Dear Dad, you didn't do a very good job of marking out those names. I could read 1 or 2 of them. It doesn't really make a difference, I'm sure, but I thought I'd let you know." So here I am thinking that the KGB had blacked out, my dad got a censored letter in, but it turns out grandfather blacked out his own names. And when I get the letter, I'm looking up at the light, I'm trying to read through it. I'm probably doing exactly what my dad did, looking up at the light, trying to read through it. So that was just interesting for me to learn that my grandfather had reached out to Khrushchev, to Abel, and to Donovan to try to get the process going to get his son released.
And the irony there is there's about 16 numbers in that letter.
8 halves of cattle, 3 heads of, yeah.
I'm like, what book code is your grandfather sending your dad? There's all sorts of code words in there, like mom is, yeah, okay, sure. Yeah.
And it goes back to family, because my father was enamored of your grandfather, and he just kept saying, "I want my boy, I want my boy," and that stayed with him through the negotiations and the hard times in Germany. Everybody else who's giving him left and right jabs, none of them knew about the boy in the prison. They just had their agendas, and it was your grandfather's personal reach out to Dad that made the difference.
And one other story I want to throw in here is after my grandfather wrote to Rudolf Abel, every piece of mail that went into prison or out from that cell was read. So the FBI got wind of it, the CIA got wind of it, that my grandfather was stirring the pot. He was writing Rudolf Abel. So 2 guys in suits show up to the family shoe store in Pound, Virginia. They walk in, "Mr. Powers, please don't meddle in our affairs. You will only make it worse for your son. We will take it from here." And sure enough, they did, contracting with Donovan to broker the exchange.
So Vin, let me ask you about the relationship between Abel and Donovan, because that's central to this movie, right? The idea, Bridge of Spies is about Tom Hanks and Mark Rylance playing these characters, that there's this almost friendship. Not almost, I think there is a friendship that comes between the 2 of them.
I think it'd be good to check out how many people have seen the movie Bridge of Spies. Oh, that's great. It is a superb movie, and it's very close to and very close, of course, to Strangers on a Bridge, Jim Donovan's book. And it comes over in the book. The 2 men clearly did respect each other, and when he got back to the Soviet Union, Fisher sent Donovan some amazing gifts, a wonderful rare book for his book collection, a painting. And another side of it, this period of history, the Soviet Union was in a mess. The law fees in the United States had to be paid, so they were paid by a third party, but they were overpaid by $200 or $300. You might have seen a picture up there earlier of Waters and Donovan. Sent the check to Vogel for the $200 or $300 that were overpaid. Unfortunately, Vogel couldn't use the check. He couldn't, so it had to go to the U.S. mission in Berlin, and the political officer there, Frank Meehan, had to endorse the check so this money could be paid over. I just think, could that possibly, like that sort of thing, possibly have happened now? Another important thing to have said, just picking up from what Gary was saying about the exchange of letters, and you've seen the movie. Certainly, the letters that were coming from, quote, Mrs. Abel, close quotes, in Germany, were being written by the KGB. And the KGB were poring over the letters from the United States looking for code, and similarly, the United States was poring over the letters from the East looking for code. So that was the letters written by the KGB. But in the movie, when they're on the eve of the exchange, you see a mother and a daughter from Central Casting. That was utterly untrue. Willie Fisher's wife and his daughter were both present. And just
Well, sort of. They were
the-
sort of present. You tell it.
you're a
Oh,
rascal.
well, they were present as part of the negotiations, but also when it came to the exchange, Willie Fisher went. It was on the Glienicke Bridge, edge of Potsdam. Why there? Well, certainly the Russians didn't want the exchange to be at Checkpoint Charlie, where the Americans would have got the publicity. They wanted it somewhere else. So it was on the edge, the Glienicke Bridge. But the other end of the Glienicke Bridge was the KGB headquarters for the whole of Europe, known by the locals as the Forbidden City. And Yelena and Evelyn Fisher had gone there to meet their husband, father. The exchange takes place, and there's a panic. The KGB can't find the two women. They've gone shopping. And imagine, the shopping, even in East Germany, was better than the shopping in Moscow.
Well, I'm going to add something about letters because we've been talking about those. When I first started doing my research into my dad's letters, I didn't think anything was censored because they were handwritten and there was no blanks and nothing was blacked out. But from listening to his audio tapes of what he went through that he recorded in '70 when he was writing his book, the KGB would have him write the first letter. They would review it. They'd say, move this, change this, take this out, rewrite the letter. He'd rewrite the letter. The third or fourth draft would finally be mailed home. And that third or fourth draft looked as if there was no censoring because it was in his handwriting. What I discovered is that, just like Vin was saying, they were trying to intercept codes. They were trying to disrupt codes. They didn't want my father to communicate with the CIA through whatever means available through coded messages or numbers or figures. And so that's why they wanted to rearrange the sequence of the letters he was writing for the first 3 months. After the trial, he could write home and there was no interception.
So Beth, let me ask you, when you did research as a middle school or a high school kid, this movie is a couple years old now, and our audience, because they're our audience, has all seen it, but it may not be necessarily something 10 years from now is going to be widely seen by everyone. How do we ensure, and it sounds like you're trying to do this through this foundation, how do we ensure that the legacy, not only of your grandfather, but also of the people he worked with, like the Gary Powers Sr., like the Willie Fisher, how do we ensure that that is continued on throughout generations?
Well, I think a number of ways. I mean, in advance of the movie, one of the things that I did was I worked to get his book republished. And, I did a lot of research on that process, and I enjoy being a sleuth and, and the process of research and, discovering new things and one thing leading to the next. And ultimately, I found who the original publisher was. So that's one thing. I think the movie, frankly, I don't mean to disagree with you, but and obviously I'm partial, but I do think that the movie is a classic and is pretty timeless and has pretty much, in my opinion, humble opinion, cemented, him in my grandfather in history, as well as, the Francis Gary Powers and Rudolf Abel, and really, brought them to, out of the shadows of history. And I think, through actually one of the initiatives that we've been working on, I think the movie really did a great job in appealing to the younger generation too. Because they didn't know about this, about this history. And one of the initiatives that our family has been working on, as well as I know Gary does too, with students around the country with National History Day. And the last few themes, they pick a theme every year, have been very relevant to, to my grandfather's legacy and the history covered in Bridge of Spies. So we've worked with many students. We anticipate more this year. I constantly am writing, I'm trying to get pieces published in the newspaper about the importance of history and the arts and classics. I think that all of those things are very, very paramount to, to continuing the training of the mind, whether you go into business or whatever. I think, one of the things about my grandfather was that he was an extremely well-rounded person. He did go into law, but he had a very multifaceted career, and he had very multifaceted talents and interests. So I think through initiatives like I'm trying to do with this foundation is working with not only youth, but people, in marginalized areas of society that don't have, the opportunity that others do, particularly in rural areas, and to act as kind of a bridge, as my grandfather was, I think, to, between small towns and urban areas, between left and right, between the public and private sectors, and to kind of, transcend those, looking at things so black and white.
For me, I wanted to pick up on what Beth is saying, because the National History Day has been fascinating. Fascinating. Beth would call me and say, guess what? We have a fifth child that wants to concentrate on dad. For me, what I've experienced is the passion. These kids are looking for a hero. They're looking for a hero. And I found adults are looking for heroes. And the one thing that I learned after this movie was everybody would come up and say, wow, finally somebody with integrity. It's good to see somebody with integrity, somebody I can look up to and say, okay, he's done right. There's a paucity of it, and this movie seemed to bring out the hunger, almost a hunger for it.
Well, I think we can say that across the board of all the people represented in the movie. So Gary, your father died long before he should have, as did James Donovan. What do you think now is important to remind people about his legacy? Because there had been for some time, and there's still every so often someone that doesn't quite understand the real story behind it. So what do you think the movie did, or what do you think you can keep doing, or we as a museum can keep doing, because the new museum will have a lot of your artifacts in it about your father, can do to try to kind of bring his legacy forward? Because this is somebody who 90% of the people probably would have found themselves in a Soviet prison in Moscow, clearly a spy, right? They weren't falling for the weather plane thing, may have cracked under pressure, and he didn't.
Well, I think history has a way of writing itself over time, especially when you talk about the U-2 incident. It's been 58 years since my father was shot down. And in the last, since 98, so 20 years, that's when the declassification really kicked in. And as a result of the history being able to have more information brought into it to shed light on what actually happened, that has helped to reveal the truth of what my father did or did not do. As I mentioned earlier, there was all the misinformation surrounding him about whether he defected or landed the plane or spilled his guts. And because of the declassification conference that happened in '98, because of the posthumous awards he was awarded as a result of that declassification, his place in history has evolved. And his reputation has shifted from one of infamy in the 60s to one of an American hero in the 21st century. And I believe that's a natural progression over time of history and how history continues to change and evolve and helps to set the record straight. But it takes time for the truth to be revealed. I believe that one of the reasons Spielberg did this movie was when I talked to him on set. He knew about my father. He knew about the U-2 incident. He knew about the exchange. He didn't know about Donovan at the time. And he read the script that Donovan, the person who brokered the exchange, who is this guy? How did he maneuver between East Germany and Russia and America and all the politics of the time to broker this exchange? So when I was talking to Spielberg, he also had a family connection to the U-2 incident. His dad, Mr. Spielberg Sr., was working for GE. He was in Russia, Moscow, in the 60s, 1960, shortly after the U-2 shootdown. This is when the plane was on display at Gorky Park. So Mr. Spielberg and 2 or 3 of his engineers from GE are walking through the line to look at the U-2 wreckage. The guards notice that they're Western. They yank them out of line. They take them to the front. They belittle them. Oh, you evil Americans, look what you do. We protect our country. And so Mr. Spielberg Sr., relates this story to baby Spielberg as he's growing up. So I believe that because his dad had a part, his dad told him a story as a young kid about the U-2 incident, that when he learned about this new script, about Donovan and the exchange and the pilot powers, the light bulb went on. He wanted to do this movie. That's why I believe he did it.
Let me ask you, Vin, about what you think Evelyn wants the world to know about William Fisher, about the legacy of, again, someone we may knee-jerk reaction to as a Soviet spy, a bad guy. But what do you think the most important thing moving forward might be?
This is a difficult one. Evelyn, whenever I spoke to her, said, I can tell you nothing about Daddy's work. At home, we talked about the important things, books, art, cooking, music. I can't talk to you about, I know nothing of Daddy's work. So I think she would say nothing. But she did say some interesting things during our conversations. She said, Vin, all this corruption now, it hasn't just suddenly started. It was there from the very beginning. And how many people here watch the Americans series about the illegals? Great. It's a superb series, over-dramatic, of course. Life is very boring. But she said something very interesting. While I was in Moscow for a while, there was a television program about an illegal woman, and they interviewed this old lady in a faded housecoat, and she'd been sent to somewhere in China as a young woman, and when she arrived in China, where she was going to be this illegal spy, she met the man who would be her husband. And whereas she did not love him, he adored her. And I told Evelyn this story, and she said, she doesn't understand what love is. So I think it was very complicated. I once asked her, because Fisher came to the United States in 1947, he went home on leave in 1955, he was then arrested and went back. I said, what was it like for you and your mother? And she said, that's the way it was. And can I tell the story? We've talked a little bit about the reputation of Francis Gary. But Fisher, when he went, he was a failed spy. He was caught, he was interrogated, the FBI admired him. They said, we tried to break the guy, but we couldn't. You had to admire him. And the court, the pictures you've seen from the courtroom, the stories you've read about the way he behaved in the courtroom, the way Jim Donovan cross-examined the other witnesses and made them look like crooks and hopeless people. Fisher's image in the United States courtroom was of an impressive, honourable man. Even though he was our enemy, he was an honourable man. And the Soviets suddenly realised they'd got something of a hit on their hands. When he went back, he wasn't a hero. He was a busted flush. They would never know what he'd given away. But he was sent around to schools to talk about how great the Soviet Union was and how awful the United States was. He was sort of, you meet lots of Russians, particularly in Moscow and in St. Petersburg in their 70s, who remember his visits to their school. So his reputation is gradually in the new Russia being forgotten.
Vin touched on honorable and professionalism and how there was a mutual respect in a way between the FBI and Rudolf Abel, the interrogators. Something similar with my father. I was told a story by one of the interrogators who wrote the questions that were asked of my father, Colonel Orlov. And he indicated to me that the KGB guards, the interrogators, had a respect for my father because of the way he conducted himself during the interrogations. And I thought that was very profound to learn, that they admired him in a way, a mutual professionalism back and forth. Now, my father, I don't believe, admired them at the time under the circumstances, but there was this mutual respect that was there when the interrogators were asking the question and how my father conducted himself. So I found that very interesting.
So Gary, you were too young to remember, but you've talked about your mom telling you stories about how your father reacted to both the almost year difference between the death of both James Donovan and Rudolf Abel, where 7 years before your father died. You tell a little bit about that.
Well, I don't know much about when Donovan died in '70. I was 5 years old, and I had not heard any stories from my mom or dad about his passing. I do have a story in regards to how my father thanked Mr. Donovan for getting him home from prison. And he sent, well, either Thanksgiving or Christmas, I don't know which one, a very large country ham, a Virginia ham. And it showed up on the doorstep.
I remember it well. I remember it well. It was, my father was flabbergasted, and it was a huge thing. We dined on it. Thank you very much. We dined on it for a week or so, and it was priceless. That was our thank you from your father at the time. When he got on the plane, didn't know who Donovan was. He wasn't sure if he was government. He didn't know what to make of it, and it was so cute because my father said that your grandfather said to him, "You crazy person! That's my buddy. That's my friend. He's on your side." So thus the ham appeared.
Yes, there we go. And then another thing in regards to when Abel passed away in '71. I'm 6 years old. I don't have a memory of this directly, but my mother told me the story when I was growing up, is that they had some friends over. They had a little cocktail party. They did a toast to Mr. Abel, basically that my father outlived him. No disrespect, but just that he's dead, Dad's alive, I outlived him.
The one thing, I think everybody seems to have a favorite in the movie, just a favorite little time. And for me, it's one word. Just one word. And the man got an Academy Award for it. But I loved it when they were on the bridge and Abel gets out of the car and he looks around and all he said is, "Jim." That melts me every time. And it demonstrates what you're talking about, where I remember this wonderful man. You know, they had an intellectual relationship. But I will say that he had my brother show up at Christmas time in the prison to sing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And Abel thought that was hilarious. And my father was a rare book collector. And so about a year after the exchange, over the wall came this package to be delivered to this man at Waters and Donovan in Manhattan, and my father was ecstatic. Abel knew he collected the rare books, and my father got a double volume on vellum of the Justinian Code, and he was beside himself, and it was the right thing to do. And it's currently on display in the Georgetown Library here in Washington, D.C., from Beth's family donated to Georgetown, where all 4 children went. So take a look.
So Beth, let me wrap up with this.
Sure.
Let me talk about the movie itself, because you've all been very, very positive about it, and you're right. I think it's an extraordinary movie. But there's no such thing as a perfect movie when it comes to getting history right. The family probably has conversations, perhaps, from time to time about little things here and there that maybe bothered you a little bit. I know talking to Mary Ellen, there's certainly things like that. So I'll give you the question, but I give you the question, and then you can certainly back up on this.
Sure. I mean, Mary Ellen, I think, because she lived through it, so.
I'm the oldest one here, apparently.
So I think maybe the inaccuracies stand out to her and my mother and my uncle more than they would to me. To me, the inaccuracies, I think, were kind of replacements. He didn't paint a portrait of my grandfather. He gave him a skiscape, which it was included in the slideshow. I guess there's arguments back and forth about whether or not there actually were shots, but they did not live in a house. They lived in a house until my mother was 12. And then they lived in an apartment building on the 14th and 15th floors. So, shooting through the window wasn't really going to happen. There are reports of somebody throwing bricks, so things like that, I think. But I think that they did that, they took dramatic license for effect. And personally, I was fine with it.
There were touching things like the idea of being in the house. I love this. They had him as everyman. opening the door of this wonderful old Victorian home. Oh my God, my mother would no sooner live in that house than the man in the moon. And all the little gewgaws throughout the house, my mother would have had them in the trash so fast. But Spielberg
But the
had-
bathroom looked like, I think, her bathroom.
Well, we could
Well,
discuss that,
okay.
but by
And the
God.
marmalade?
But I will say that it was Spielberg who was dealing with an international audience. And how do I say an American family life fast? How do I say it fast? And that was the perfect thing to do. We had no issues. But I will tell you something fun. I love it when there's a scene where Tom Hanks is saying, I've been called. I've been called over to see a client in Scotland, and we're going to go fishing. Well, the first time I saw the movie, and I thought, fishing? My father's a lawyer that would never touch a dead fish or a live fish. That isn't happening. That is not happening. I thought, Lord. And it struck me as funny because during the process of him disappearing, Dad said he was going to play golf in Scotland. He needed a break. And that made perfect sense to us. If he had said he was going fishing, we would have definitely called that one out. So we would get postcards from Scotland. And Dad had filled them out, and then agents in Scotland were mailing them to us so that we indeed, weather's so good today, or, now today's rainy, So we were along for the ride, all these great postcards. Nobody called. At that time, none of us called overseas or anything. So what really was terrific was at 2 o'clock in the morning, which varies from Pierre Salinger on the television, 2 o'clock in the morning, the phone's ringing, and I remember it so clearly. And it woke my mom up, and I came running in, and this man from the New York Times is on the extension and says to my mother, "Oh, you must be so proud. You must be so proud of him and what he's accomplished." And she's pretty sleepy and trying to figure it out, and she says, "Did he get a hole-in-one?" I mean, we had not a clue what he was talking about. It was priceless.
And one discrepancy that I want to mention with the movie and my dad and what he went through. In the interrogation scenes in the movie, the KGB guard is holding up the silver dollar. "Oh, look what the evil Americans give your spy pilots. They wanted you to use this." Well, they didn't have the silver dollar. Dad, on the way down, threw it away. He thought that the first thing a Soviet would want as a souvenir is this silver dollar that was hung around his neck. So he took the poison-tipped pin out and put it in his pocket. The pin was given to the pilots optionally. It was optional to take, optional to use at their discretion in the event of torture. So in the movie, Spielberg takes some liberties, shows that the KGB have the dollar. They take some other liberties in that the shoot-down sequence scene. Dad does not see 2 missiles before he's shot down. In the movie, you see 2 missiles. It's building dramatic effect. The 3rd missile in the movie hits the plane, the tail section, it pushes it forward. In the movie, it's zooming down. The dials are unwinding. The canopy's starting to crack, building dramatic effect. In reality, as soon as the missile hit, the nose pitched forwards, the wings broke off right away, it goes into an inverted spin, and Dad's being thrown around trying to get out, does not use the ejection seat. He basically crawls out of the plane. He is attached by his air hose in real life, 2 or 3 feet of air hose, half in the cockpit, half out of the cockpit, being banged around. His faceplate has frosted over. He can't see outside of past his nose. He can't see the destruct button. He can't feel it, can't reach it. But in the movie, again, differences. The canopy's cracking, it shatters, he's sucked up out of the plane. In the movie, 10 feet of air hose, wildly swinging around the fuselage, crawling hand over hand back into the cockpit. Dramatic effect. So some misinformation did sneak into the movie from the newspapers of the time. And I think Spielberg did that intentionally because it's what people remember reading. But they did also honor my dad at the end of the film through the postscript, I think it's called, where they acknowledge him as a hero to our country through the awards he was posthumously awarded.
And you've mentioned the awards, but you didn't specify it. We're talking about the Distinguished Flying Cross. We're talking about the Silver Star. These aren't like, the Boy Scout badge for doing good things. These are, massive major awards. The Silver Star is the third highest award for valor in the country. So this was not just great job, Gary. This is coming back and truly honoring him for his service.
And it took 50 years, respectively, first in 2000, which was the 40th anniversary, and then 2012, which was the 50th anniversary of the exchange. And it just goes to show that it's never too late to set the record straight. And the family, Powers family, was very humbled, very honored that the CIA and the Air Force stepped up to the plate and did acknowledge my father as a hero to our country. We all completely understand why they couldn't do it earlier. It would have been nice had they done it when Dad was alive, but the politics of the time did not allow for that to happen.
So I've monopolized the question answering, and I could keep talking for another hour or so, but I'm not going to do that because of all you fine people. So we are going to open it up to the audience. Please wait for the microphone to come around. I see Amanda's coming with the microphone. So come on, Amanda. There she comes. There she comes.
She's got the
All
purple
right.
shoes on.
Wonderful presentation. It was said at the time, and it's been said since, that it was criticized as an unequal exchange, even for those who recognized the heroism and courage of your father, that the Soviets got the better of the deal. So I'd like to hear assessments of, was this an equal exchange or was it an unequal exchange?
Well, I'm going to start with that one. Yes, I understand it completely what you're saying about people in the press at one point in time said it was like trading Mickey Mantle for a rookie. And my dad being the rookie. So I believe that while it may not have been an equal exchange, it was beneficial to both governments in that my dad got brought home and was debriefed. He was then able to communicate to his superiors what questions they asked. What type of knowledge were they looking for? How did you evade answering questions? Can you help our agents learn what you went through so they can know what to do if they're captured? Same thing with Abel. Abel wanted the KGB wanted him home to be debriefed. The CIA wanted my dad home to be debriefed. So in that respect, it was an equal exchange.
Also, what Kelly Johnson was able to learn.
And Kelly Johnson, even before Dad was brought home, during the debriefings with Kelly Johnson, my father said, this is what happened, an explosion, a shockwave, the wings broke off, down I fell. And after Kelly Johnson, the designer of the airplane, listened to my father through the debriefing, asked him questions back and forth, he goes, yep, that's exactly what would happen. I have no doubt that he did what he did. So that was a nice accolade.
That's a damn good question. Thank you for it. I think it was an equal exchange. It was one man for one man. But Fisher didn't stop his work when he was in prison in the United States. He got to know Soviet agents who were in prison. He didn't give away anything of the rings that he was responsible for, of the people he was people he was paying, the people he was giving orders to. He didn't give any of that away. At least we don't know that he didn't give any of that away with the evidence that we have at this moment. So I think it was an equal exchange, but what the Soviets got back was someone who was very, very important and very, very useful.
And one other thing I want to piggyback on with that is Abel did not give up any information to his FBI interrogators, nor did my father. But in the press, he spilled his guts. He collaborated with the enemy. He didn't follow orders. When my father was debriefed at a safe house in Maryland, 3 weeks of debriefings, they'd come back and forth to the shoot down. How high were you flying? Are you sure there wasn't a flame out? No, I was at altitude, 70,000 feet, making a left-hand turn, vectoring in for my next target, and the shoot down sequence occurs. How did I want to say this? The press that put all the misinformation out there, the fake news of the era, was detrimental to my father. But my father didn't care about what other people thought he should or should not have done. He knew that what he did under the circumstance he found himself in was the correct thing to do. And he was often quoted as saying he'd do the exact same things again, given the exact same set of circumstances. So Abel gets accolade for not spilling his guts, not talking to the enemy. My father gets criticized for talking to the enemy, though he didn't do it. So I find that very unique. And the other thing is, during the interrogations, when my father was going through these interrogations, he had to appear to cooperate. He had to pretend that he was trying to help them answer the questions to the best of his ability. All the while, he wasn't giving them any information of use. When Dad is brought back home and debriefed, the CIA figured this out. When my father shot down, oh crap, Dad knows this program, B program, C program, D program. We have to get those offline, get those guys out of there. Dad gets home and debriefed. Hey, Frank, did you talk about this? Oh, no, I didn't say that, didn't mention this, didn't talk about that. Oh, get these programs back in. So he was debriefed. They realized he didn't spill everything he knew. He only cooperated to the extent that they believed he was cooperating with them.
I mean, this question, real quick. This question really is an indictment of the negotiator. So maybe perhaps you want to chime in that the person actually negotiated this was your father. And certainly he probably thought that this was an even trade.
Yeah, I agree with what both men are saying. My father had come up with the idea. It was a brain germinated during the. He knew that you don't let a colonel in the KGB walk. He wasn't going to be sent home. Something had to be arranged. What is that? Why would you kill a colonel in a KGB? Why would you do that? It doesn't benefit anybody. Keep that colonel. You may well need that man. And I will tell you that both presidents, Eisenhower initially and Kennedy, were all over this. This is the way to go. So they believed also that this was the right timing. It was on an international stage. I mean, the Paris peace talks, everything was getting crazy. So in essence, yes, the presidents believed it. My father believed it. And certainly, just talking to your grandfather, let's just do the humane thing. And also, you have to stand up for your own men. It doesn't matter what your status is. My father believed, let's get our own man back. Let's get him back. So my father didn't view it as colonel for a spy pilot. No, it was a man for a man. And Americans are going to show the world that we get our guys back.
Something's just occurred to me that we've all seen the movie. The Americans got the better of the exchange because they got two men back. They got Fred Pryor back. And that's really interesting. I hope you saw on the slides that Beth put together earlier. One of them is me with a gentleman by the name of Francis J. Meehan, now in his mid-90s, who was United States ambassador in Warsaw, in Prague, and he was the last United States ambassador in East Germany at the end of the Cold War. But as a young diplomat, he was in Moscow and was deputed to go and view the U-2 wreckage. He was sent from the embassy. And in Germany, he was responsible for the Frederick Pryor bit of the exchange. He's written a lot of stuff for his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, but he did say to me before I left, if I could find a United States publisher who was interested, in his mid-90s, he might have his mind changed.
And what other questions? Oh, they got one there? Okay.
Hello. I'm Cynthia Wingard Lynn, and I hope someone here remembers my parents, but I remember your dad because I was there in Germany.
Which dad?
Gary Powers'
Okay.
dad. I was there when my dad left to pick him up, and I was there when they brought him back to the safe house that we lived in. This is it because I copied it and built it in Columbia, Maryland, so my children would see it. It was a phenomenal place with lots of secret staircases, but beyond that, I was there, and I almost messed up the whole thing because I was late for school and jumped in the van I wasn't supposed to be in, and I'll tell that, I won't go into all that, but when he came back, they brought him to Germany. My dad picked him up and with two other agents, and picked him up and brought him back and brought him into the safe house that we stayed in. My parents went out for the day, and my older brother and I were there, and we heard a noise behind the door. And so I said, Mike, someone's there. And he says, no, there's not. And I said, yeah, there is. He said, get a bobby pin from Mom's room and we'll pick the lock. So we did. And there was your dad. And you do look a lot like him, but he had blacker hair and sharper features, but I can see your shadows. And he was younger. Age, yes. And I was younger too. But he was pretty upset with us because he was supposed to be protected, obviously. And they did debrief him there as well. Right. But then we got nabbed because all of our nannies, et cetera, were all agents and they wore guns and they pulled them out on us. So we got in lots of trouble for this.
This is a funny story. A bobby pin, I love it.
It did, but hey, they're supposed to keep him safe. And a bobby pin, my mother's bobby pin opened the door. I'm not kidding. So I'm glad that he got back safe. I'm glad the story was done and he was finally acknowledged for what he did. It was our fathers were in peril all the time. And there's a lot more, but I hope you and I can talk later. And I'll fill you in on the rest of the story. I would love to do that at some point.
And
okay.
Don't lock a door around her, because obviously.
I wonder if anyone of you could speak about the artifacts in the back. Specifically, I was curious about the briefcase. If they said it was Frank brought it back, and was it his? Did they bring it to him, the family, or did they give it to him, the Russians?
Yeah, the suitcase in the back of the room is the suitcase that my father walked across the bridge with when he was exchanged. We tried to get Mark Platt to put one of his wicked suitcases that looked very similar in the movie to walk across, but they didn't do the suitcase. It was a Russian Soviet suitcase. There's a sticker in it that's in, Cyrillic. So it's a Russian-made suitcase from the 1950s, probably the late 50s. And they gave it to my father so he could pack the few belongings he had in it to walk across the bridge. So that's how he got the suitcase. When Dad came home, it sat in the trunk and the footlockers and the closet for years and years and years. It used to contain all the videotapes, audio tapes that my father did for his book and a couple of other tchotchkes, souvenirs that my father brought home from prison. Dad was given a small allowance, 10 rubles a month or something, maybe a little bit more. And he could not take any of these rubles out of the country. It was illegal to do so. He did get a few out. He smuggled them out, have those at home. But he bought a couple of souvenirs for family. They took him around the last day he was there. They wanted him to spend his rubles. And so he bought a little plastic bear and a little plastic this and a little wooden sculpture that to bring home to family and friends. So we have some of these both on display around the country and at home in my little credenza.
Can you talk about the sketchbook, Vin, that you have back there?
Yeah, the items at the back, the sketchbook, Willie took back on his last, his leave home. He had to go back for 6 months for debriefing and rebriefing. It was, his leave. And he was an artist. He, as Vince said at the beginning, he would have preferred to have been an artist rather than an illegal spy. But so his sketchbook was when he left the United States in 55 and came back in 56. The painting is one he did in the United States. Have a good look at it. It's in Atlanta, Georgia. We've never been able to work out exactly where it is. So if anyone knows exactly where it is,
There might be a hole in the tree where he left a message or something.
and the two cups, born and brought up in the United Kingdom, his childhood beaker that he drank from, and the cup that was his father's cup, Heinrich. So that cup was held by a hand that had shaken Lenin's hand and drunk from with lips that had kissed Lenin as well, because that was the custom of greeting. And they were gifts to me from Evelyn, but three of them, have been in boxes or envelopes for some years, and they're here on a medium-term loan so that more people can see them, and they'll come back to me or my grandson when that time is over.
And you, in your family, has some extraordinary stuff as well. Not only not only the painting that was given to you by Fisher, the one that's not the one at the end of the movie, because they changed that one, but also Castro gave what a humidor was a gift to your father as well.
My father didn't smoke cigars, but we have 2 humidors. My father, Kennedy was trying to figure out how to handle this Bay of Pigs, and he, because my father was an independent lawyer, so the decision was made he would represent the parents of the children who were captured. So, children, well, they're young, very young men. But so the parents gave my father a fabulous humidor. And then Castro gave Dad a couple of things. It was a wonderful humidor, but also dominoes. Dominoes. And this is very off script, but there were some funny stories that went on in Cuba. And, you know, they tied into the Spy Museum. I lived in Brooklyn, and I would try to drag my father to movies as often as I could. So on Flatbush Avenue, they had Goldfinger, one of my favorites, no question about it. So we get outside, and I'm just euphoric. I'm thrilled with this movie. And he says, boy, you really like that movie. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, most of those gadgets exist. They weren't gimmicks. I mean, I know you all view it that way, but I had a tracking device in my shoe the whole time I was in Cuba, because I go in by myself, and they had to know where I was and what was going on. So even little tidbits on Flatbush Avenue were kind of interesting.
Did he ever tell you the story that he was asked by CIA to bring a very particular wetsuit into Cuba with him?
Yeah, well, that was interesting because my brother-in-law, Robert Fuller, Rob Fuller said to me, I'm over here in Asia, and they've got a Newsweek article about your dad, and it says he was given a wetsuit by the CIA to bring to Castro, and they were called, in CIA, the men who came up with assassination attempts, and there were so many of them, on Castro. They were called the boys on the 4th floor. Now, I've spoken at the CIA since, and they said they're down in the basement now. I said, well, what did they do wrong? What did they do wrong? But the article in Newsweek, Rob Fuller said, it says your father unwittingly purchased his own wetsuit and brought his own. I said, my father never did anything unwittingly in his life. And so he wasn't going to do, his score was, they tried to get him to do it, and he said, look, I'm not in the business of assassination. I'm in the business of negotiation. So you boys do what you want to do. They put disease inside of the stuff. Yeah, and he'd lose his hair, and if Castro didn't have a beard and hair, maybe he'd lose favor. All these crazy gimmicks, but no, exploding cigars, all kinds of wild stuff. But he brought him his own wetsuit. Yeah.
Vince, you might want to mention that the artifacts have gone away. They will be back in the new museum in the spring. And Beth has brought some things that are still out that we're keeping an eye on. Maybe you want to mention what you...
I was going to say, you have medals or things up there.
Yeah, I brought a case. I think we have another case. My brother has a portion of his medals, but it's a beautiful case of various honors that my grandfather received. I was going to bring one of these sketches, and actually these are some other interesting artifacts. By sleuthing during the process of republishing the book, I found this one sketch at home that was kind of, not hanging anywhere. It was just amidst, I don't know why it wasn't hanging anywhere. It's a wonderful sketch. And I looked at the name on it, and it was a very prominent illustrator, William Sharp, and it was a rendering of the courtroom scene. And I did some Googling, and somehow one thing led to me to another, and it led me to this law firm downtown on Wall Street. And I didn't really know. I went through this long story when I called, and the woman said, oh, I'll put you right through to the partners. And she put me through to this man who immediately said, "You have to come down to our office. We are the two remaining lawyers left of, the fifth iteration of your grandfather's firm, because the firm, the name of the firm is no longer, anything with Donovan in it. They absorbed the last, it's a firm called Marshall Dennehy, and these men have been tremendous stewards of some of my grandfather's belongings over many years in the office, including 5 of these original sketches by William Sharp, a beautiful or very ornate chair that was given to my grandfather by Cardinal Cushing in Boston for the release of the Cuban prisoners, or the Cuban American prisoners, and the original transcript of the Abel case. So unfortunately, I don't have those here, but I did include a lot of the pictures in the slideshow. But I did bring the medals.
And we, as a family, were in such shock about this movie because my father was relatively unknown. And it was a shock. So how do you thank Spielberg? How do you thank Matt Sharman, who wrote the screenplay? How do you thank Tom Hanks, who even got down? It was very eerie to watch him. In jail, for instance, he would rub his hands. My father rubbed his hands just like that. It was really spooky a little bit. How do you thank these men? And so that was very interesting. Is Chris Murray here?
Yeah.
There he is. Chris and I don't talk very much, and it's abysmal that we don't, because he's cute as a button. This man is great. What a talent. If anybody's been to Govinda Gallery in Georgetown for 40-odd years, Chris is renowned in the world of photography and so much else that couldn't be mentioned in public. But anyway, Chris, I'm on the phone with him, and I said, I don't know what we're going to do for Tom Hanks. What do we do? So out of nowhere, Chris says, I actually have something. Since I'm a cousin, I have got the right thing. And I said, oh my God, thank God, what is it? And he said, I had been to George Harrison's home in England, and George said, let's go out to my garden. And Chris said, can I photograph you? And you can correct me, but he said, yes, you can, but I never, ever want it published, ever. And he agreed to it. So now, so many years later, he says, I've only printed it once, and it was for his widow. And I happen to know, which I certainly didn't, that Tom Hanks's #1 in the world is the Beatles. So it's a passion of his, is music. He adored George Harrison. And by the way, Mary Ellen, he had been to that same garden in George Harrison's home. So it was a phenomenal experience to put that frame together with a book plate, because George Harrison collected rare books. And his talented wife had done an etching that St. George, which is a patron saint in Great Britain, is on horseback, to slay the dragon. But it had George Harrison's face on it. And it was a newborn baby in there, all the things that would mean something to George. It was phenomenal. So I framed both in one frame, and then told this entire story that you're hearing tonight on the back side of this. And we got a thank you that was adorable, because Beth had found out that Tom Hanks collects antique typewriters. So I get this crazy little envelope, and Tom Hanks, it was personal stationery, and on it he had typed the whole thing on one of his old typewriters, and so everything's going up, going down, this and that. Each one of the men got something. Matt Sharman, my father, would still be a footnote in history if it hadn't been for a British screenwriter. And what do you give this man? And I only had one thing, my dad's. And it was a gorgeous lighter. He was an inveterate smoker. And I'd had it for 40-odd years, and what am I going to do with it? You know, and if there was ever a moment to give it away, it would be to a man that brought my father out from the footnotes. So I put it in a very interesting shadow box, and at the top it says, to Matt Sharman from a grateful Donovan family, and at the bottom it says, and it's 3D, and at the bottom it says, Jim Donovan carried this throughout the Cold War. Oh, is this man happy? This man is so happy with this. So that's been interesting. And I wanted to tell you about Steven Spielberg. It was fascinating. First of all, Mark Platt said, now you be nice to him. I said, what do I do? What do I say? He's very shy, and you know, he's on the quiet side. And I said, we'll be good to him. We'll be good to him. What a self-effacing, quiet, gentle soul that only wants to know about you. He's just the most wonderful individual. And he said, I'm so happy to talk to you because my last movie was Lincoln, and I had nobody to talk to, which I thought was hilarious. And then he was talking about his dad, and Gary knows his dad. And I said, well, Steven, by this time, he's Steven. I said, Steven, did your father see the movie? And he said, oh, yes, I showed it to him last week. I said, well, what did he say? And he says with pride, my father said it was neat. The premier director in the world, and his father thought it was neat. And I said, you're kidding me, right? And he said, no, this is a high accolade from my father. This is a high accolade. So my best story is Charles Pink here? He is the director of the OSS Society here in Northern Virginia. And he was gracious enough to make me part of the OSS Society because my dad had been in it. So he called me up, he said, you're gonna meet Hanks, you're gonna meet Spielberg, you gotta do something for me, you know? So he was-
Sounds like Charles.
right? So he loaded me up with all, I said, no. I was up in New York, he's down here, and I said, I'm not handing them in the middle of a premiere pamphlets and things. I'm not doing it. So I said, I'll tell you what I will do. You have the coolest OSS ID card from the 1940s. It's the coolest thing. Why don't you make each of them an honorary member, and I'll be happy to do that. Because they're little, they're the size of a driver's license. I will do that. So I was a little embarrassed. I don't know what it is, but this man said, he had just gotten the Medal of Freedom last month in Washington. I thought, oh God, what am I doing? So at the end of all our time with him, I was beginning to get embarrassed, but I had to do it. So I said, Steven, and I passed it over on the table and then handed it to him, and I said, you are now an honorary member of the OSS Society. Now this quiet, self-deprecating man went nuts. I thought I had given him a truck out of a cereal box or something. I couldn't get over it. He picked it up. He said, oh my God, this is so cool. This is so cool. It was the neatest thing. He started jumping up and down. It was the most animated we had seen him. It was adorable.
He's like a little
boy.
He has his inner child is alive and well, and that is why he is the most brilliant director and lovely
he
man.
Put the OSS button on. It was adorable to watch. And lo and behold, the next night when I did the same thing with Tom Hanks, I said, Tom, you know, we've made you an honorary member. And he looked at it and he said, oh my God, this is so cool. This is so neat. He was printing Sully and his hair was all gray. And so he said, oh my God, this is so cool. He says, Mary Ellen, which button should I put on? This one, this one? I said, well, one day, one the next, you know. Both, and then I understood why they're best friends. Because they have this joie de, they're like little boys. And it was adorable to watch this. And I wanted to share it with all of you because they're so down to earth and so genuine, and they see world through a different prism than so many others like them. So I just wanted to tell you that fun story.
I think it was 3 years ago that I first met Mary Ellen, and the first conversation was, I've been cuddled by Tom Hanks when I was a little girl, and now I've been cuddled by Tom Hanks, now I'm a big girl.
So what we're going to do is we're going to run the slideshow again. It'll be up here as people can mingle and have a conversation. Obviously, we have the books in the back. If you want to take, grab one of them and have someone, Gary or Vin, sign the book. But as of now, let me thank Mary Ellen, let me thank Gary, let me thank Vin, and let me thank Beth for taking the time to talk to us here tonight. We really appreciate it. This is a fantastic program, so please join me in thanking them here. And we'd like to thank all of you for coming out tonight. One last thing before I send you on your way. We are going to be doing programs here for the next about month and a half, and then we are done for about another year. Because the museum here closes on January 1st, and we don't reopen until the spring, and we won't start doing programs again until probably the fall. So check out on the back on the table. We have all the programming that we're doing here in the fall. Get a chance to come check out what we do here at the museum, and we really appreciate you coming out tonight. Thank you so much.